Hey guys, Louie here with Self-Inflicted Recovery, Redemption, and Life. Tonight is June 27th of 2019. If you've been with me for a while, you already know a bit about me. My addiction ramped up when I was 16 to 17 years old. I used pretty hard for about 17 years, lots of different things. In the beginning, it was cocaine, marijuana, and alcohol. Towards the end, it was only marijuana and alcohol. At this point, I've been clean for about 4 years. As I got clean, I realized that my addiction caused a lot of pain and misery in my life, and it also caused pain and misery for those who cared about me. This podcast is an effort to share some of the things that I've learned and realized over the last several years. Also, some of the things that I realized pre-sobriety. My hope is that it helps people who are considering starting the journey towards getting clean and sober, or perhaps help those who have already started down the path to stay on the path, or perhaps even help some of the normies out there to understand, how things look and how things feel from where we are seated. If this is helpful, or if you can relate, please take a moment to share it with others. If you're listening on iTunes, please take a moment to scroll to the ratings and review section. Provide me a rating and write a review if you're so inclined. Doing these things will help me to get this out to more people. So, I actually got back in town today from the beach with the wife and kids, and I wanted to take some time to discuss, how I interact with my children and discuss addiction. So, when my son was 3 or 4 years old, this was still when I was drinking and getting high all the time. I was awake early one morning and I was ironing a dress shirt from work. And at this point, usually I would get my clothing dry cleaned. So he had never seen an iron before. This was his first time seeing an iron. And, I'm in the kitchen ironing on the ironing board. He comes out all sleepy-eyed and he asks me what I'm doing. And I explain to him, I'm ironing. I want to make my clothes look nice. This is an iron. It's hot. I use it to make sure that my clothes are crisp and unwrinkled. And I'm about to put down the iron and grab the starch, which is behind me on the counter. And I knew that when I was a kid, people told me to do something, or they would told me not to do something, or that something bad would happen. I would want to test the waters. I would want to push the envelope. I would want to see how bad the consequences really were. Check them out, make sure they weren't full of crap, basically. And I wanted to, as a child, get as close to the forbidden behavior as possible without actually suffering the consequences. And since he is half of me, and he likely shares some of my tendencies and proclivities, I make an effort to be more clear with him, because I know that he's probably going to be, he probably has a desire to push the envelope just like I did. So before I turn around and grab the starch, I tell him, hey man, you see that? It's hot. I know it doesn't look hot, but it is. Don't touch it, or it'll hurt you and burn you very badly. A lot of pain. So I then turn around to grab the starch, and in that split second, true to his genes and true to my genes, he touches the iron and starts screaming. And then my wife comes out, she starts coddling her little boy, and she blames me for him not listening to his old man and paying the price consequently. She says, how could you possibly allow this to happen to my beautiful little prince? I'm clearly exaggerating here. That's not really what she said, but you get the idea. And I'm like, I told him not to touch it. He doesn't listen. He paid the price. I wasn't happy that he burned himself, and I wasn't happy that he was in pain. I'm not a sociopath or anything. I love my son with all my heart. But I also knew that he hadn't really hurt himself that bad. His body would heal, and it was a valuable lesson times 2. Lesson number 1, listen to the old man or pay the price. Lesson number 2, don't touch irons because they're hot. As parents, sometimes we feel like we should protect our kids from everything, including themselves. I think this goes back to the time when our children are babies and toddlers, and they're not capable of protecting themselves. Eventually, though, they need to protect themselves by using knowledge and making observations. So we want to protect them from making mistakes that are going to cause them pain. But in reality, once they hit a certain age, all we can really do is arm them with knowledge, and then hope that they make the right decision. And that's hard, because our instinct from when they were younger is to protect them. So, I knew growing up that addiction ran on my mom's side of the family. My grandfather was an alcoholic. What finally killed him was when he quit drinking. He was around 80 years old. He quit drinking and he basically died from withdrawals. However, I didn't know that meant that I could be an addict. And I also didn't know how dangerous addiction was and its capacity for causing pain. Not necessarily physical pain, but also emotional pain. So several months back, I also found out that addiction ran in my father's side of the family. And that was not something I knew before. That was actually a surprise. So, when I was a child, my parents were very uncomfortable having the hard discussions. For example, they weren't really comfortable talking about sex, or drug use, or alcohol use. They pretty much avoided talking about anything that was forbidden or taboo. So, I never got a warning about addiction. I never had a discussion or warning about drug use aside from the content offered by the school system, the DARE program. So, reflecting on that, I think that if I'd had a discussion with my parents about addiction, I would have appreciated it. At the very least, it would have been helpful for them to convey the idea that some people are addicts and some aren't. Some people can have a beer or a glass of wine or smoke a joint or a bowl or whatever, and some are simply not capable of that. Like me, one's never enough. There's only one objective when I start drinking or start smoking or start doing whatever. And that objective is absolute obliteration, total annihilation. And I would have appreciated a warning so that when I got to be a teenager, when these things were offered to me, by people who may or may not have the potential to be addicts, that for me, it could possibly be taking the first step down a path that could be life-altering and have some very serious consequences, even disastrous consequences. I don't really know if that would have made a difference. Maybe I still would have insisted on touching the hot iron and learning the hard way, but it would have been good to at least be given a warning that I am potentially not like normal people, and that if I start doing certain potentially addictive things, it might enslave me, it might take me over, it might control me. So, my parents didn't warn me, and let me be clear, I don't bear any resentment towards them for that. Society didn't know as much about addiction back then as we do now, nor was actual communication around uncomfortable topics a social norm at that point for the generation. Things just tended to be swept under the rug. But I fully intended on making sure to warn my kids, to have those conversations with them early and often, and to evolve those conversations as they become older and more capable of dealing with the knowledge and information. So, if I don't have those conversations with them, it's almost like having a minefield in the backyard and never warning them, hey, that's a minefield. If you walk over there past that fence, your arm or your leg could get blown off. So, I think for most of us, myself included, the introduction to drugs and alcohol happens in our teenage years. It would have been good to have knowledge around these things prior to encountering them, So, I've known this conversation with my kids was coming for a few years now, and I've been trying to work out how that conversation will go. Lucky for me, my son forced that conversation himself. So, maybe 6 months ago, my son was in the grocery store with me. And actually, it was probably 8 months ago. So he would have been 8 years old. I have this special recipe that I cook chicken legs with, and it calls for beer. In the first year or two, I wasn't strong enough to cook with beer or any kind of alcohol. It would have been dangerous for my sobriety. But maybe 2.5, 3 years in, it was a different story. So we're at the grocery store, and we go down the beer aisle, and my son says, "Wow, Dad, look at all these weird types of soda. Never seen these before." And I asked him what he knows about addiction. And he replies, "You mean like a dictionary?" He gets mad points for being a verbal samurai. And I'm like, "No, not a dictionary, addiction." And he says, "I don't know what that means." I then explained to him that these aren't soda, that they're beer. It's alcohol. And the reason you haven't seen them before is because Dad doesn't drink alcohol. Then he asks the next logical question. Why don't you drink alcohol, Dad? And I say, because I'm allergic to alcohol. It makes me make bad decisions and do things that I regret. And to be more specific, it makes me make bad decisions about how I treat the people that I love. I also tell him, when I say some people are allergic when they drink alcohol, they have a hard time stopping. And the more they drink, the worse their decisions get. And a lot of the time, they end up hurting themselves somehow, or hurting someone else, or doing something they regret. And I love you, and I love your sister, and I love your mom, and I want to treat you guys good. I love you guys, so I don't want to drink. Because if I did, I would probably make bad decisions about how I treated you guys. I also took a moment to explain the concept of addiction. The idea that there are people out there who start to do things that feel good, and after a while, they start doing those things more and more, and eventually they can't stop, even when it causes them pain, whether it's physical or emotional. So that was the end of the conversation. We go home. I cook on the grill, and the day continues. Throughout the rest of the day, we revisit the topic in bits and pieces. I share, some additional things with him. I dropped all the science on him over multiple conversations throughout the remainder of the day. At times, there was smoke coming out of his little ears. And I didn't want to overwhelm him with this stuff. It's kind of advanced for an 8-year-old. But one of the things I explained was that I had this problem. And, I used to drink to excess pretty much constantly. And that I had to quit because at the end of the day, it caused me not to be the best father that I could be to him and his sister. And it caused me not to be the best husband I could be to his mother. And I loved them so much that I couldn't allow this to continue. And that they deserved and I deserved the best version of me possible. So I guess through school, the examples he was most familiar with were nicotine and alcohol, due to some of the programs and campaigns in school. And I explained to him those things aren't good for people's health. And when you become addicted, you do things even though they're not good for you or even though they hurt. I also explained the idea that we have the addictive gene in our family, and that I got it from both of my parents' sides of the family, and that there's a good chance that he has it too, and that he'll be offered these things by people in the future, some of whom don't have the addictive gene, and that it could be disastrous for him. Also, that when that time comes, it might be better to just never try those things and avoid taking the risk altogether. Now, like I said before, I know this is advanced stuff for an 8-year-old, and my theory on parenting is this. I want to have the uncomfortable conversations, preferably before they have a need for that knowledge. And I want to repeat those conversations often so that they can ask questions, and so that when they finally arrive at the time they have to deal with the situation, it is something that we've talked about many times, and hence they'll be better equipped to handle it. For example, he also knows how babies are made, and he knows that if he makes a baby, it's his job to take care of it. So don't make babies by accident, particularly with women who are terrible and who aren't wife material, damn it. Anyway, so a month or so later, all 4 of us are sitting there watching TV. Me, my wife, and both my kids. And he asks, Dad, how do you know how much alcohol will kill you? How do you know when you sip a beer one time that you're not just going to drop dead? And at this point, I don't really know where he learned you can die from drinking alcohol. But this is a prime opportunity to have a good conversation about it, both with him and my daughter and my wife all at once. And I explained to him that when you drink and do drugs, I remind him that your brain doesn't work quite the same. It doesn't work quite right. And a lot of times that means making bad decisions. And those bad decisions can be physical, or they can have to do with how you interact with people. Your body doesn't work quite right either. You may not be able to move normally, or maybe see things the right way, or keep your balance quite as easily, and all these things can put you in danger. I then go on to further explain that when people die from alcohol, it's usually one of 3 ways. Number 1, they make a bad decision, and it leads to them dying. Maybe that means falling down the stairs and hitting their head, or falling off a balcony or a cliff, or driving their car into a tree, or trying to walk across the street and not seeing a car and getting hit by it, whatever. Option 2 is aspiration, which means, obviously you fall asleep face up and then you puke in your sleep and choke to death. Option 3 is by just plain drinking too much. Alcohol is basically poison, and if you drink too much of it, your body gets poisoned, it shuts down, and you die. I explained to him that when you drink, you don't just make one drink and then die. It does take some effort to consume that much alcohol, and your body will do its best to keep you alive, by making you vomit, etc., pass out. But at a certain point, if you drink too much, your body can't save you, and you just die. I also asked him if he remembers how Dad told him that he's allergic. And he said, yeah, I remember. And then I say, and you know how Dad is tall? And because of that, you're tall, right? And he says, yeah, I know. So then I remind him, being allergic to alcohol could be the same. Since I'm allergic, you could be too. It's not guaranteed, but it is very likely. So it might be a good idea to not drink alcohol. Or if one day you decide to drink very, very little of it, and don't make it a habitual thing. Don't do it frequently. Don't do it often. So part of me being allergic is once I get started drinking, it's very difficult for me to stop. And those 3 situations I talked about, that can lead you to death, making bad decisions, aspirating, or drinking to the point of poisoning oneself. Those are all very high physical cost in terms of danger and damage to one's body. So that's how that conversation went. And I plan on repeating it from time to time and answering questions and, building on that conversation as he gets older so that him and my daughter both understand and know the potential dangers of drug and alcohol, so that when they encounter it as a teen, they'll understand that they're really playing with fire. And hopefully repeating those conversations, over the years will give them time to reflect and ask questions as they develop and get older. So I can't control my children's behavior. They'll own their own behavior when they get older and the consequences that go along with it. But what I can do is make sure they have the knowledge and I can stay involved in their lives to provide guidance. I've come across quite a few of us whose parents told their kids about their drug use and glorified it. But to me, that seems extremely dangerous because it's like telling them about the fire and that the fire's great and to go over there and burn yourself because it won't hurt you that bad, Had I been told about my genetic propensity for addiction and warned about it, I don't know that I would have made any different decisions in terms of my choices around drugs and alcohol. But who's to say if having a warning would have made a difference? Maybe things could have or would have gone differently. Who knows? Maybe I wouldn't have gone so far down the rabbit hole that was quote unquote feeding my addiction. Maybe I never would have started, or maybe I would have decided to get clean that much sooner. This also ties into the topic I discussed in episode, I forget which episode it was. It's the one where I discussed what might have been. I read that addiction recently, I recently read that addiction has a tendency to skip generations, and the statisticians and scientists aren't really quite sure why. But one theory is that when a child has parents with addiction, they witness a lot of crazy shit, and they feel quite a bit of physical or emotional pain, maybe both. And when they grow up, they already know what it leads to. And as a result, they steer clear of, drugs and alcohol. Then what happens is they have kids. And since the parents, whose parents were addicts and caused them pain, since the parents aren't struggling with addiction themselves, then, a lot of times they don't talk to their children about it. But the gene still gets passed on. And then their child gets to be 16, 17 years old or goes to college and they start drinking or smoking cigarettes or smoking pot, and that fire of addiction gets lit. And we all know the rest of the story. I guess I'll have to weave this into my conversation with my children to reinforce the idea that they need to talk about this with their children to guard against future issues. So, my children have already gotten the warning about addiction. We'll continue to have those conversations and build on it. Just like I warned my son about the hot iron, it's up to them if they want to get burned by it or not. They'll be getting an honest discussion about this from me. They deserve to know the dangers. The other day I was, discussing this topic with a friend of mine, He is the only friend that I still spend time with regularly, who I used to use with. We've been good friends since high school, but I don't see him that often. He still drinks, he still smokes. We used to do a lot of drugs together. Anyway, we were talking, and he was telling me that, kind of similar theme, he was telling me that he wished his parents had warned him about the dangers of drug and alcohol use. And, I told him that's funny because I was just writing this and I was going to record this episode in the upcoming weeks and discuss how I have frank and honest conversations with my kids about this stuff. And I find that when I'm with him, he fills in a lot of the blanks on some of the events that occurred while I was using. A lot of that stuff is, kind of funny in terms of how insane my behavior was at times. But we were talking about it, and we talked about how lucky we were that none of our behavior got us seriously injured or killed. And I acknowledge that. I'm a statistical anomaly. Most people who behaved the way that I did ended up getting seriously injured or even killed or in jail. This goes back to, my addiction and also the ways that I chose to make money growing up and things like that. Then he brings up, how do I address that part of life with my kids? You and me had a lot of fun doing all that stuff. And I hadn't really thought about that part of it. Beyond just acknowledging mentally that I wouldn't be telling any of my kids that, because I refuse to glorify or glamorize any of that stuff. Romanticize it. That's another term that's thrown about. So my response was, well, what kind of message are you sending them when you tell them that drugs and alcohol and addiction are bad and dangerous things, and then 5 minutes later you're telling them about all the fun you had? You're sending them basically the message that you're full of shit and that everything that you say is suspect. And instead of listening to you, and heeding your warning that they should try it out to make sure you're not full of it, And I went on to say, I'm probably never going to tell my kids about that stuff. Ever. Or if I do, it'll be like when they're much older, maybe in their mid-20s or early 30s. Because by that time, they'll be able to sort out, okay, so this story is, this story is something that he's telling me that's fun, but they'll be able to sort out and understand that part of this is dangerous. It did result in some potentially humorous situations. If you tell them about this kind of thing when they're young, all they're going to hear is, this is fun. And our kids want to be like us. And since we're still alive and not in jail, and we didn't screw up our lives too terribly, they'll think that they can do some of the same things and they won't suffer consequences. They won't hear the rest of the message that this stuff is dangerous, particularly because of their genetics. So if my goal is to give them knowledge and warning, I'm damn sure not going to dilute that warning by glamorizing and romanticizing the very behavior that I'm trying to dissuade them from. As a parent, this whole concept is scary. The idea of arming your children with knowledge and then letting them make their own decisions and pay the price for them sometimes. Unfortunately, I won't always be around for them. So my job is to shape them into functioning human beings who can make good decisions. Hopefully they make those decisions well. So that about wraps it up. I'm interested in hearing other people's thoughts and perspectives on this. Would you have explained it any differently? Is there anything important that I maybe missed? Would you have chosen not to explain it at all like my parents did? Do me a favor, send me questions, comments, topics you want me to discuss to selfinflictedrrl@gmail.com. If this was helpful and relatable, please share it with others. If you're listening to this through iTunes, please take a moment to scroll to the ratings and review section, provide me a rating, write a review if you're so inclined. Doing these things will help me to get this out to more people. On this particular episode, I did the audio production myself. Despite that, I still wanted to shout out Doug Snyder. He does a lot of the audio work on a lot of these episodes, and even the ones where I do the work, he's still sharing his knowledge and his teachings and his expertise with me, rather. So that's all I got for you. Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening. Louis out.